Julia Ferraro had cleaned up after the Enrico family for 4 years. She had mopped blood she was not allowed to ask about. She had laundered silk shirts she was not allowed to touch with bare hands. She had answered doors for men whose faces she was not allowed to remember. In 4 years, she had learned one rule above all others. The help does not exist. The help does not see. The help does not speak. She was 23 years old, 5'2", and earned enough each month to keep a single-room flat warm and little else. Her hands were red from bleach and cold water. Her feet had memorized every crack in every marble floor in the Enrico estate. She had worked through Christmas, through her father's surgery. Through the night she got the call that her mother had died, because no one had told her she was allowed to leave. She did not complain. She did not ask. People like Julia did not complain. They became part of the walls, wallpaper in human form. And the Enricos moved through her the same way they moved through rooms, without looking, without stopping, without noticing she was alive. Until the night the blizzard came. And the twins did not cry. She was carrying the trash through the rear courtyard when she saw the basket near the stone column. She almost kept walking. Julia Ferraro had trained herself not to see things that were not her business, and in a house like this, almost nothing was her business. But the basket was pink, bright, impossible pink, the only color left in a world that had turned entirely white. She told herself it was laundry. She told herself it was flowers. She told herself not to look. She looked. 2 newborn girls lay inside, swaddled in a single thin blanket already weighted heavy with snow. Their lips had gone the color of a winter sky, pale, pale blue. Their eyes were closed. They did not move. They did not cry. And 20 feet away, walking calmly through the blizzard toward the warm light of the manor, was the black silhouette of a woman in no hurry at all. Julia dropped to her knees in the snow and screamed. The wind swallowed it whole. No one was coming. She understood that in the same instant she understood everything else, that someone had put them here deliberately, that the temperature was falling, and that she, the invisible girl, the wallpaper, the ghost of the Enrico estate, was the only thing standing between the Don's heirs and a quiet, frozen death. She had never mattered to a single person in this house. Tonight, she would matter to 2. So she pulled off her cardigan, then her apron, then pressed both children against her chest inside her yellow uniform, wrapping her bare arms around them in the snow, and began to pray that someone would find them before she stopped being warm enough to help. What Paolo Enrico found, 7 minutes later, was a yellow dress in the white hell of his courtyard, and inside it, somehow, 2 living daughters. The maid who had saved them was not moving, but she was still breathing. And Paolo Enrico, the most feared man in northern Italy, stood in his courtyard in a blizzard holding 3 people at once, and for the first time in his adult life, he did not know what to do next. He would figure out the who and the why later. The footprint in the snow near the column would wait. The custom orthopedic sole, the one he recognized from a receipt in his own desk drawer, a birthday gift he had chosen himself, would wait. Everything would wait. He carried them inside, and he did not put any of them down. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button to support me. Share this video with the friends you love. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now, so you will not miss the next deeply moving stories. The trash was heavier on storm nights. Julia had never understood why, only that it was always true, as if the cold drove people indoors to consume more food, more wine, more of everything the Enrico estate had in bottomless supply, and left the wreckage for her to deal with at 11 o'clock in a blizzard. She hauled the second black bag through the rear service door and into the courtyard, her shoulder already aching, her breath coming out in pale clouds that the wind immediately stole. The snow had been falling since early evening and had stopped asking permission somewhere around 9. It lay thick and undisturbed across the stone courtyard, erasing the garden, swallowing the low hedgerows, piling itself against the base of the old column near the east wall like it intended to stay forever. The lights from the manor's rear windows cast long amber rectangles across the white ground, warm and distant, the kind of warmth that exists specifically to remind you how cold you are. Julia kept her head down. That was another thing 4 years in this house had taught her. Keep your head down, finish the work, get back inside. Or she did not linger. She did not wander. She moved through the estate's outdoor spaces the way she moved through its hallways, quickly, quietly, without leaving any evidence that she had been there at all. She was halfway to the waste enclosure when she saw it. She almost didn't. The basket sat at the base of the stone column, half buried already, the snow piling over its woven rim the way it piled over everything else, patiently, indifferently, without particular urgency. Her eyes passed over it the first time and filed it away as nothing, a decorative piece left outside by mistake. Someone's forgotten delivery. Not her business? She had taken 4 more steps before something stopped her. Later, she would not be able to name what it was. Not a sound. The wind had taken care of sound. Not a movement. Something quieter than both. And some animal instinct that lived below, thought, below reason, below the 4 years of careful training that had taught her eyes to slide past things that didn't concern her. She turned back. The basket was lined with a blanket, the color of a pale rose, and the blanket was moving. Barely. The faintest rise and fall, so slight she might have imagined it. But she hadn't imagined it. She crossed the distance in 3 steps and dropped to her knees in the snow beside the column, and the cold soaked through her uniform instantly, shockingly, like pressing her legs against a slab of stone pulled from a river in January. There were 2 of them, newborns, impossibly small, pressed together in the basket's center, swaddled in that single thin blanket that had long since lost any warmth it may have held, and their faces were the color that stopped her breath entirely, not the red-pink of sleeping infants, not the soft gold of the babies she had seen carried through the estate's corridors in the weeks since their birth. These faces were pale, pale shading toward blue at the lips, pale the way marble is pale, the way snow is pale, the way things are pale when the warmth has been leaving them for a long time. Ludovica, Carlotta. She knew their names. She had folded their tiny garments in the laundry room. She had heard the staff whisper that the Don had wept when they were born. This man who, it was said, had never wept for anything. They were not crying now. That was the worst of it. Infants in distress cry. Infants past distress go quiet, and these 2 were utterly, terribly quiet. Julia screamed. She screamed with everything she had, tilting her face up toward the amber windows and the warm world behind them, screaming the way she had never allowed herself to scream inside those walls, without restraint, without dignity, without thinking about what happened to maids in this house who made too much noise at the wrong moment. The blizzard consumed it entirely. The wind simply took the sound and pressed it flat and scattered it across the snow, and that was the end of it. The windows didn't open. No door swung wide. The courtyard remained exactly as empty as it had been. It was in the silence after her scream that she saw the figure. A woman. Black coat, dark hair, moving through the far edge of the courtyard at a pace that did not suggest panic or urgency, or any awareness whatsoever that something had just gone terribly wrong 20 feet behind her. Or she moved the way people move when they have finished a task, steadily, with purpose, with the particular calm of someone who had already decided not to look back. She stepped into the shadow between the exterior wall and the garden gate. And then she was gone. And Julia was alone in the snow with 2 dying children and the sound of her own heartbeat, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that no one was coming. No one but her. She had never made a decision that mattered. That was the thought that moved through her as she knelt there in the snow, strange and clear and arriving without invitation, the way certain truths do when the mind strips itself down to what is essential. 23 years of careful smallness, of taking up the least possible space, making the least possible sound, wanting the least possible amount from a world that had made it quietly understood that girls like Julia Ferraro were not meant to want very much at all. She had never made a decision that mattered. She made one now. Her fingers found the ties of her apron first, the thick canvas one she wore for heavy work, double-layered, the one she had complained about privately because it trapped heat in summer, and now, on her knees in a blizzard, she understood was the most valuable thing she owned. She pulled it free from her waist and spread it open across her lap in one motion, not letting herself slow down, not letting herself think past the next immediate thing, because she understood instinctively that hesitation was a luxury she didn't have. She lifted Ludovica first. What the infant was so light it frightened her, lighter than she remembered from the times she had seen the nursemaid carry her through the corridors, as though the cold had already begun its quiet theft. Julia pressed the child against her chest and wrapped the apron around her in overlapping folds, tucking the edges beneath the small body, sealing out the wind as best she could. Then Carlotta, smaller even than her sister, her lips the color of a bruise, her tiny hands curled at her chest like a question. Julia pulled her close on the other side, pressing both infants against her sternum, her chin dropping to rest against the tops of their heads, and then she reached up and began to unbutton her cardigan. The wind found her the moment the first button came free. It moved across the exposed skin of her collarbone like something deliberate, like a hand pressing flat against her chest and pushing. She kept going. Second button. Third. She peeled the cardigan from her shoulders without loosening her grip on the children, a slow and awkward choreography of elbows and careful shifts of weight. And when it finally came free, she wrapped it around both infants together, over the apron, over their heads, tucking the wool sleeves in beneath them to seal the bundle closed. What remained was her uniform, thin yellow cotton, short-sleeved beneath where the cardigan had been, designed for work indoors in a heated manner and entirely useless against a night like this one. The snow landed on her bare arms and did not melt. She folded herself over the children. It was the only thing left to do. As she curved her spine and dropped her shoulders and made herself into a shell, a canopy, a roof of living warmth over the bundle in her arms, pressing them into the hollow between her ribs and her thighs, blocking as much wind as her body could block, which was not much but was something, and something was what she had to offer. Her arms began to burn. Not from cold, not exactly. It was a deeper sensation than cold, something that moved beneath the skin and into the bone, a slow and consuming ache that she recognized dimly as the body beginning to negotiate. She had read once, in a school book she could barely afford, that freezing was not painful at the end, that it was cold, and then it was heavy, and then it was simply quiet. She did not know if that was true. She hoped it was true for their sake, and not for hers, and she pushed the thought away and replaced it with the only words she could find. She prayed, not loudly, not even in full sentences, because her jaw had begun to tremble, and full sentences were complicated now. She prayed in fragments, the pieces of prayers her mother had taught her in the kitchen of their small flat in Napoli. The ones she had said were for when everything else had run out. She whispered them into the wool of the cardigan and the cold air and the storm, and she did not know if anyone was listening, but the act of whispering kept her mouth moving and her mind tethered to something outside the cold. The amber windows of the manor blurred at the edges. She blinked, and they sharpened, then blurred again. The snow accumulated on her shoulders, and she no longer felt it land. Ludovica shifted against her chest. A small, an involuntary movement, the unconscious press of an infant searching for warmth, and Julia pulled her tighter and bowed her head lower and held on. She was invisible. She had always been invisible. But she was here. She was warm, or warm enough, or at least warmer than the snow, and right now that was the only thing in the world that needed to be true. She held on, and she whispered, and she waited. Paolo Enrico had not known fear in 11 years. He had known anger, which was a different animal entirely, controllable, useful, a tool he had learned to pick up and set down the way other men picked up and set down a pen. He had known grief briefly when his father died, and he had processed it the way he processed most things, efficiently, privately, and without allowing it to interfere with what needed to be done. He had known danger in forms that would empty the blood from the faces of ordinary men, and he had met each version of it with the same flat steadiness that had made him, by 38, the most quietly feared man in northern Italy. But when Sarah, the head nursemaid, had appeared at the door of his study with empty arms and a face the color of fresh chalk, something had moved through Paolo Enrico's chest that he had no practiced response for. He had been in the courtyard inside 40 seconds. He moved through the rear service door with a flashlight in one hand and nothing in the other, and the blizzard hit him the way blizzards hit people who have not dressed for them, total and indifferent. The wind pressing his shirt flat against his chest, the snow finding the collar of his jacket immediately. He did not slow down. He swept the flashlight across the courtyard in a long arc, left to right, the beam catching nothing but white and the dark geometry of the garden structures beneath their burden of snow. Then the beam caught yellow. It registered as wrong before it registered as anything else. That particular shade had no business existing in a courtyard in January. Too vivid, too warm, an interruption in the monochrome world the storm had made of everything. He crossed the distance without deciding to, his feet moving before the thought completed itself, and when he reached the column and understood what he was seeing, he dropped to his knees in the snow beside it. She was curled over them like a closing hand. Her back was to him, her spine curved, her bare arms wrapped around a bundle of wool and canvas from which two small faces emerged at the top. And he saw the faces first, saw the faint color in their cheeks, saw Ludovica's mouth working in the unconscious way she had when she was about to demand feeding, and something in his chest that had been seized tight for the last 4 minutes released so suddenly it felt structural, like a cable cut. His daughters were alive. He reached for them with hands that were, for once in his life, not entirely steady. He pulled the bundle open carefully, checking each face, each small hand, running his thumb across Carlotta's knuckles, and feeling warmth. Not much, but present, real, the warmth of a living thing that had been shielded from the cold by the body now collapsed against the base of the stone column. He turned to her then. Julia had fallen sideways at some point, Whether seconds or minutes ago, he could not tell. She lay with her cheek against the snow, her bare arms still loosely curved in the shape of the children she had been holding, her yellow uniform darkened at the shoulders where the snow had soaked through. Her lips had taken on a color that made his jaw tighten. Her eyes were closed. The visible skin of her arms and neck had gone past pale into something that had its own specific gravity, its own specific warning. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat. A pulse. Slow and soft and shallow, the kind that asks a question rather than making a statement, but present. She was breathing. He could see it, the faint, labored rise of her ribs, the small cloud her exhale made in the frozen air. Paolo Enrico stood up in the snow with his daughters pressed against his left side and the maid gathered against his right, and he lifted all 3 of them at once with the particular economy of a man who has never once in his adult life stopped to consider whether something was physically possible before doing it. He turned toward the manor, and he opened his mouth. The sound that came out of him crossed the courtyard and hit the rear windows of the estate, and brought 4 people to the glass before he reached the service door. It was not a word exactly. It was the sound a man makes when words are too slow, when language is an obstacle, when the only thing that matters is that everyone within range understands immediately that there is no time. The door opened before he reached it. He carried them through into the light and warmth of the service corridor, and he was still moving, still issuing instructions in a voice stripped of everything except precision and urgency, directing the nursemaid toward the children and the housekeeper toward the telephone and the remaining staff toward the east wing where the estate doctor kept his rooms. He did not put Julia down. He carried her himself all the way to the medical wing, her bare arms hanging limp and pale over his forearm, her dark hair trailing, her chest still moving, still asking its quiet, fragile question against his side. He carried her as though she weighed something worth carrying. Because she did. The doctor had arrived with his bag still open. Paolo had stood in the doorway of the medical wing long enough to watch the man's hands move with the kind of practiced calm that meant he had seen worse and knew what to do. And then he had turned and walked back through the corridor without a word to anyone. There was nothing useful he could do in that room. He had never been good at waiting beside beds, at watching, at the particular helplessness of standing near someone who needed medicine rather than decisions. He left the twins in the nursemaid's arms and Julia in the doctor's care, and he walked back through the service corridor and out into the storm because there was something he needed to see before the snow took it from him. He had perhaps 20 minutes, maybe less. The courtyard looked different now, or rather it looked the same, which was the problem. The blizzard was a thorough and indifferent archivist, filling in every depression and impression with the same patient industry, smoothing the record of the last hour back into unmarked white. The beam of his flashlight moved across surfaces that were already softer than they had been when he crossed them 9 minutes ago. The edges of footprints going gentle, the sharper details beginning to round. He went to the column first. His own tracks were still visible, deep, long-striding impressions leading from the service door to the base of the column and back, and beside them, the shallow oval depressions where Julia's knees had pressed into the snow. He crouched beside them, the flashlight angled low, and examined the ground with the same methodical patience he brought to every problem that mattered. But most of the surrounding area had already lost its definition. Whatever prints the storm had not yet claimed were smeared and shallow, overlapping, useless. The wind had seen to that. He moved the beam slowly outward from the column in a widening arc, checking each shadow and depression, cataloguing and dismissing. He almost missed it. It was tucked against the base of the column itself, sheltered from the direct fall of snow by the overhang of the stone cap above, pressed into a narrow strip of ground that the blizzard hadn't yet managed to reach. A single print. Left foot from the depth of it. The person's weight transferred forward, as though they had paused here, leaned briefly against the column, and then pushed off to leave. Paolo lowered himself until he was nearly at ground level and held the flashlight parallel to the surface. The tread came into relief immediately in the raking light. He was not a man who forgot things. It was perhaps his most useful quality and his least comfortable one. The inability to lose information, to let details soften or fade the way most people allowed them to. The way the snow was allowing the rest of this courtyard to fade right now. His memory kept everything in the same high resolution it had arrived in, filed and cross-referenced, available on demand without effort or intention, so he did not have to think very hard about where he had seen this tread before. A zigzag pattern across the forefoot, not the aggressive diamond cut of a walking boot, but a finer, more deliberate geometry, almost decorative, of the kind of detail that distinguished a craftsman's work from a factory's, and at the heel, a reinforced arc, slightly wider than standard, built up to redistribute weight, the signature accommodation of a custom orthopedic sole, made for a specific foot by a specific hand in a specific shop. He straightened slowly. The wind moved across the courtyard and he did not feel it. He stood at the base of the column with the flashlight hanging at his side, its beam cutting a pale stripe across the snow, and he looked at the print for another long moment without moving, without needing to move. The process of conclusion had already completed itself in the space behind his eyes, quiet and irrefutable, the way conclusions do when every variable has only one possible value. He knew those boots. He knew the shop in Milan where they had been made. He knew the measurement consultation, the 3-week wait, the velvet box they had arrived in. He knew the morning he had presented them, and the hands that had received them, and the occasion, a 67th birthday, a formal lunch, a gesture of respect toward a woman he had trusted without question for the better part of his adult life. He knew exactly whose foot had made that print. The flashlight beam held steady on the impression in the snow, and Paolo Enrico stood very still in the blizzard, and something in him that had always been warm went very, very quiet. He turned back toward the manor. He had a receipt to find. The office was the one room in the estate that belonged entirely to him. Not in the way that the rest of the manor belonged to him, by inheritance, by title, as by the transfer of power that had occurred at his father's funeral, with all the ceremony and none of the warmth of such occasions. The office was his in a more fundamental sense. He had chosen its furniture himself, arranged it himself, and over 14 years of use had imposed upon it the particular order of his own mind. Everything cross-referenced, everything retrievable, nothing kept that did not earn its place. Other men in his position kept assistants for their paperwork. Paolo kept his own files because he did not trust the information they contained to hands he could not fully account for. That discipline had never felt more useful than it did right now. He moved through the door without breaking stride, shedding his snow-damp jacket across the back of the nearest chair without looking at it, and went directly to the cabinet against the east wall. Third drawer from the top. Personal expenditures, filed by quarter, subdivided by category. He had built the system himself over a decade of use, and he navigated it now the way he navigated familiar rooms in the dark, without hesitation, without fumbling, his fingers moving across the hanging folders with the light sureness of a man who has never once misfiled anything. He found the quarter he wanted, pulled the folder, and carried it to the desk. The receipt was where receipts always were, in chronological order, clipped to the itemized log he kept for every significant personal purchase, the kind of documentation that most men his age and station considered beneath them, and that Paolo had long understood was simply another form of precision. He had learned from his father that power without record-keeping was just theatre, impressive until the moment it needed to be proven. He found it inside 40 seconds. The paper was cream-coloured, heavy stock, the letterhead embossed in a restrained charcoal, the mark of the kind of establishment that considered printed logos a form of vulgarity. He had been to the shop once, in the company of the woman herself, who had mentioned the place with the particular casualness people use when they want something and have decided not to ask for it directly. He had registered it without comment and returned 3 days later alone. He read it now in the lamplight. Calzoleria Orsini, Milano. Custom orthopedic leather boot. Cognac. Last, F38 narrow. Sole, reinforced arch support. Zigzag intermediate tread, extended heel plate. Door lining, full-grain lambskin. Delivery, estate address. And beneath that, in the polite, precise language of a craftsman who understood discretion, commissioned as a gift. Recipient, Benedetta Enrico. Occasion, 67th birthday. He set the receipt down on the desk. He did not move for a moment. The lamp cast a circle of warm light across the surface, and outside that circle the room was dark, and the house around it was quiet in the way houses go quiet during storms, every sound muffled, every edge softened. Somewhere in the east wing his daughters were being warmed back to themselves. Somewhere in the medical wing, a young woman with bare arms and a borrowed pulse was being pulled back from the edge of something she had walked to the very rim of on their behalf. And somewhere in this house, Benedetta Enrico, née Ricci, the widow of Aldo Enrico the Elder, acting capo dei capi, by the authority of a succession clause his father had written when Paolo was still in school, and which Benedetta had spent the intervening years reminding everyone of at regular intervals, was either sleeping or performing the performance of a woman who had spent the evening in her rooms, untouched by the night's events. She was the only person in this estate who wore a size 38 narrow. She was the only person in this estate who had those boots. She was the only person in this estate who understood, with the cold and intimate accuracy of someone who had spent decades studying the architecture of power, that the fastest way to end Paolo Enrico's bloodline was at the very beginning, before names were entered into records, before loyalties transferred, and before two small girls grew old enough to become a dynasty. He had bought her those boots himself. He had driven to Milan, selected the leather, approved the tread, carried the box home, and placed it in her hands with the filial respect of a man who had been raised to treat her as a mother. He looked at the receipt for another moment. Then he folded it once, with great care, and placed it in the interior pocket of a dry jacket. He would need it later. He was going to need everything he had. She had chosen the drawing room deliberately. Paolo recognized that the moment he stepped through the door. The drawing room was the estate's most formally appointed space, the room used for receiving, for negotiating, for the kind of conversations that required the weight of surroundings to make their point. Benedetta had positioned herself at its center, in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, wrapped in a dark robe, her silver hair pinned with the care of a woman who hadn't, despite the hour and the supposed crisis, allowed herself to appear undone. A cup of something warm steamed on the table beside her. Two of the senior house staff stood near the door, their faces arranged into the expression of people who have been told to witness something. She had set the room. She had chosen her audience. She had been ready for him. Paolo. She rose as he entered, and her face performed grief with the fluency of long practice. The eyes softened, the brow drawn together in maternal anguish, one hand lifting toward him in a gesture of shared suffering. "My boy. I came as soon as Sarah told me. Those poor children. Those poor, precious girls." She pressed her fingers to her lips. "To think that someone came onto this estate and—" "Sit down, Benedetta." Something moved briefly behind her eyes. Then she settled back into the chair with the careful grace of a woman who had decided that compliance, in this particular moment, was its own form of strategy. "You found them," she said. "Sarah told me they were alive. That the maid found them." She paused, and in the pause she did something with her expression. A small recalibration, a delicate repositioning of concern into something more complicated. "I have been sitting here thanking God for that the children were found in time." "They were not found by accident," Paolo said. He remained standing. He had not moved from the center of the room. "Julia found them because she was working. She was in the courtyard taking out refuse." "Of course." Benedetta nodded slowly, her hands folded in her lap. "Of course she was." Another pause. The firelight moved across her face. "Paolo, I don't want to speak out of turn. I know this is not the moment. But there are things about that girl that have troubled me for some time, and after tonight I feel I would be failing you if I didn't." "What things?" It was not a question. She treated it as one anyway. "She has always been too curious," Benedetta said, her voice measured, reasonable, the voice of a woman presenting reluctant evidence in the service of someone she loved. The staff have mentioned it. The way she moves through rooms she has no business being in. The questions she asks, and I never said anything because I thought perhaps I was being uncharitable. She lifted her eyes to his. "But Paolo, who else knew where the children slept? Who else had access to the nursery corridor? Who else could have taken them outside without anyone questioning why she was there?" The two staff members near the door did not move. Benedetta let the silence work for her, let it settle into the room the way she had no doubt rehearsed it, settling, in the hour between the alarm and this moment. "It is possible," she continued very gently, "that the girl took them, that she intended something, a ransom, perhaps, or simply the attention of a house that has never paid her very much, and that the storm overtook her before she could act on whatever she had planned." She shook her head with great sorrow. "It would not be the first time someone in a position of trust has—" "Julia Ferraro is in the medical wing." Paolo's voice had not changed in volume or temperature. It had simply become more precise, the way a blade becomes more useful when it is narrowed. "She is there because she removed her own clothing in a blizzard to keep my daughters warm. She is there because, by the time I found her, she had given so much of her body heat that she could no longer hold her head up. She is there because she screamed for help and the storm took the sound and she stayed anyway." Benedetta's expression held. It was, Paolo noted, an impressive performance. The grief didn't collapse. The concern didn't sharpen into anything revealing. She simply looked at him with the patient, sorrowful eyes of a woman being misunderstood by a son she loved too much to argue with tonight. "I only want what is best for this family," she said quietly. "I have always only wanted that." Paolo looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. He turned and walked back toward the door, and he did not tell her what he had in his jacket pocket, and he did not tell her what he had seen in the snow beside the column, and he did not tell her that the boots in her closet were, at this very moment, still wet. He let her keep the room and the fire and the performance. He would not need to take them from her tonight. The first thing she was aware of was warmth, not the desperate, manufactured warmth she had pressed into the bundle of children in the snow. That warmth had been a transaction, something she had spent rather than received, drawn from reserves she had not known she possessed until they were nearly gone. This was different. This warmth came from outside her, from the weight of blankets and the close air of a heated room, and it arrived with the slow authority of something that had been working on her for a long time before she was conscious enough to notice it. The second thing she was aware of was that her arms hurt. Not sharply, deeply, the kind of ache that lives in the tissue rather than on the surface, the kind that arrives not during the damage but after it, when the body has finished the emergency and begun its accounting. She became aware of it the way you become aware of a sound that has been present for some time before you actually hear it. Suddenly, and all at once, and with the sense that it had been there waiting for her to catch up. She opened her eyes. The ceiling of the medical wing was pale and unfamiliar. A lamp burned on a table somewhere to her left, turned low. Through the single window she could see that it was still dark, still storming, the snow pressing itself against the glass in shifting curtains. She turned her head slowly and found the room empty. She remembered the basket, the cold, the bare skin of her arms against the wind, the sound her own voice had made disappearing into the storm. She remembered Paolo Enrico's hands, which had surprised her, not their strength, which she had expected, but their carefulness. She closed her eyes again, and then opened them, because she had the distinct and unspecific sense that she should stay awake, that it mattered, or for some reason she could not yet fully articulate, that she remain present and aware. The door opened quietly. She turned her head toward it, expecting the doctor, expecting Sarah, expecting one of the junior staff with water, or with the news that the children had survived the night. She had almost composed her face into the appropriate expression, grateful, small, the expression of a maid in a bed that did not belong to her, when she registered who was actually standing in the doorway. Benedetta Enrico moved through the door the way she moved through every room in this estate, as though it had been built for her specifically, as though the air inside it rearranged itself upon her arrival to be more suitable. She was dressed now, fully, formally, not in the dark robe from the drawing room, but in the structured clothing of a woman who wished to project authority, even at whatever hour this was. Her silver hair was immaculate. Her hands were folded before her. She closed the door behind her without looking back at it. The room became a different room. "You're awake," Benedetta said. Her voice was quiet and warm, and carried within it the specific texture of concern that Julia had heard her use with Paolo, the maternal register, practiced and exact. She crossed to the chair beside the bed and lowered herself into it with unhurried grace, and for a long moment she simply looked at Julia with an expression of gentle relief, as though she were a beloved member of the household, and this visit a natural extension of that affection. Then the warmth in her eyes receded, very slightly, like a tide. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Better, madam." The words came automatically, trained into her by 4 years of conditioned response. "Thank you for... I want to speak with you," Benedetta said, "before the house wakes up, before things become complicated." She leaned forward, just slightly, and her voice dropped to a register that did not change its surface pleasantness, but compressed something beneath it into a new shape entirely. "You have been through something frightening tonight. Trauma does strange things to memory. It distorts, it invents, it causes people to believe they saw things they did not see, or to misremember things they did see in ways that cause a great deal of unnecessary difficulty." She paused. "For everyone." Julia did not move. She lay very still beneath the blankets, and she looked at the face 6 inches from hers, and she understood, with the same clear animal instinct that had sent her back to the basket in the snow, exactly what was happening in this room. The silence extended. And then, because she was 23 years old and her arms ached, and she was still not warm all the way through, and she was, whatever else she was, constitutionally incapable of saying the dishonest thing, when the honest thing was sitting right there waiting to be said, Julia Ferraro opened her mouth. "I saw the silhouette," she whispered. Her voice was thin from cold and disuse, but it was steady. "In the courtyard, when I found them." She held Benedetta's gaze because she could not look away from it, because looking away felt like the more dangerous option. "It looked like you, madame." The room went absolutely still. Benedetta's expression did not collapse. It did not harden. It did something more controlled than either of those things. It simply became very, very quiet. The way a held breath is quiet, the way the moment before a decision is quiet. She was still holding that quiet when the door behind her opened, and Paolo Enrico stepped through it. He had been standing in the corridor for longer than either of them knew. He had arrived at the door of the medical wing 4 minutes before he opened it, and he had stood in the corridor with his hand not yet on the handle and listened, not out of strategy, not out of any calculated desire to gather evidence before announcing himself, but because the moment his hand had touched the wood, he had heard Benedetta's voice through it, and something had stopped him, or something cold and deliberate that lived below instinct and above decision. He had waited. He had listened to his stepmother speak to an injured young woman in a darkened room in the language of soft threat. He had waited until Julia had finished saying what she said. Then he had opened the door. Benedetta turned. Her composure was remarkable. He had always known that about her, had admired it once, had understood it as a form of strength. She turned to face him with the expression of a woman interrupted in an act of private kindness, her hands folding themselves back into her lap, her chin lifting by a single degree. "Paolo." I was just sitting with her. "She's had a terrible night, and I thought—" "I heard what you thought." He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He did not look at Julia yet. He would, but not yet. He needed to finish this first. "I stood in the corridor, and I heard exactly what you thought." For the first time in Paolo Enrico's memory, Benedetta did not immediately fill a silence. She let it run for 2 full seconds, which was, he understood, her own form of recalibration. And then she turned to look at Julia with an expression that shifted from warmth to troubled reluctance, the performance of a woman being forced by conscience into difficult honesty. "She is confused," Benedetta said quietly. "The cold does that. The doctor will tell you the same. Hypothermia affects cognition, affects memory. She has been through a shock, and her mind is trying to construct a narrative around it." She looked back at Paolo with eyes full of sorrow. "Well, she is a frightened girl who looked into a blizzard and saw a silhouette and has decided it resembles me. I do not blame her. But Paolo, you cannot—" He reached into his jacket. He placed 2 things on the table beside Julia's bed. The first was a photograph, taken on his phone in the courtyard, the flashlight raking low across the snow to throw the tread of the boot print into high relief, every line of the zigzag pattern and the reinforced heel plate rendered in precise shadow. The second was the receipt from Calzoleria Orsini, cream paper, charcoal letterhead, unfolded and smoothed flat, the relevant line legible to anyone standing close enough to read it. Benedetta's gaze dropped to the table. It stayed there for just a moment, 1 moment, controlled and brief, before returning to his face. "A footprint in the snow," she said. "You are standing in this room, accusing me of—" "I am not accusing you of anything," Paolo said. "I am showing you 2 pieces of paper. I am going to ask you a question, and then I am going to send someone to your rooms. And after that, I don't think there will be very much left to discuss." He held her gaze. "When did you last wear the boots I gave you for your birthday?" The fire in the small grate across the room clicked and shifted. Outside the window, the storm continued its patient work against the glass. Benedetta sat very straight in her chair and looked at Paolo with the eyes of a woman who had navigated 67 years of difficult rooms and had never once left one on terms that were not her own. "This is beneath you," she said quietly. "Your daughters are safe. That girl is alive. Or this is a night for gratitude, not for—" Paolo turned to the door and opened it. 2 of his men were in the corridor. He spoke 4 words to them, and they left without acknowledgement, the way men do when the instruction is clear and the authority behind it absolute. No one spoke. The room held its silence for 6 minutes. Paolo stood. Benedetta sat. Julia lay still against the pillows and did not move, her eyes tracking between the 2 of them, with the careful quietness of someone who understands that they are in the presence of something much larger than themselves and has the wisdom not to interfere with its conclusion. The men returned. One of them carried the boots. Cognac leather, custom orthopedic sole, size 38 narrow. Held out across both forearms the way you carry something that needs to be seen clearly, or it needs to be presented without ambiguity. The lambskin lining darkened at the toe. The outer leather still carrying, along the welt and at the heel, the unmistakable residue of snow that had soaked in and not yet finished drying. Still wet. Paolo looked at the boots. He looked at Benedetta. She was looking at the boots too, and her face had finally, after a lifetime of perfect composure, run out of performance. What remained underneath was neither guilt nor fear. Exactly. It was something older than both. The expression of a person who has made a calculation, pursued it to its conclusion, and arrived at the moment where the calculation is shown to be wrong, and who has enough self-knowledge to understand, in real time, exactly what that means. "You were my father's wife," Paolo said. His voice was quiet. It was the quietest it had been all evening. "I chose those boots myself. I drove to Milan for them." He picked up the receipt from the table and the photograph beside it, and he placed them both in his jacket pocket. Then he stepped back from the chair and looked at his men and said, very simply, "Take her." She did not make a scene. That, perhaps, was the most Benedetta thing about it. She rose from the chair with the same composed deliberateness with which she had lowered herself into it, smoothed the front of her jacket with both hands, and walked to the door between the 2 men without being guided. She did not look back at Paolo. She did not look at Julia at all. She passed through the door of the medical wing and into the corridor, and her footsteps receded with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a woman who had decided that if this was to be her exit, she would choreograph it herself. The door swung closed behind her. The room settled into the particular silence that follows the end of something. Not empty, but altered, the air carrying a different quality than it had before, the way a room feels different after a window has been opened and closed, changed by what briefly moved through it. The fire across the room continued its small, indifferent work. The lamp burned on. Paolo stood for a moment with his back to the bed. Then he pulled the chair around and sat down in it, and for the first time since he had crossed the courtyard with a flashlight and found a yellow dress in the snow, his shoulders descended from the position they had held all evening, not relaxed exactly, but released, but the careful posture of sustained emergency giving way to something more human beneath it. He looked at Julia. She was watching him with the dark, careful eyes of a person trying to determine whether it was yet safe to breathe normally. She had not moved from the position she had held throughout the confrontation. Very still, very contained, the instinct of 4 years of service so thoroughly ingrained that even lying in a medical bed in the aftermath of near-fatal exposure, she occupied the smallest possible version of her own space. He reached out and picked up her hand from the blanket. She went rigid for a fraction of a second. He felt it, the reflexive tension of someone unaccustomed to being touched by the people they worked for, by anyone in this house, perhaps by anyone in a very long time. Then it passed, and her hand lay still in his, and he looked down at it in the lamplight. The skin across the knuckles was dry and raw, reddened in the particular way of hands that had been very cold and had come back from it. The fingers were still slightly swollen. She had small hands. He had not thought about that before, but they were very small, and he had folded them around his daughters in the snow and given them everything she had. He did not say anything immediately. He was not a man who filled silences for the sake of filling them, and this one did not need to be filled. It needed to be inhabited for a moment, recognized for what it was, the quiet on the other side of a night that had asked more of this particular person than he had words adequate to account for. "Ludovica and Carlotta are well," he said finally. "The doctor examined them an hour ago. They are warm. They are feeding." He paused. "They are alive because of what you did in that courtyard." Julia's throat moved. She said nothing. "I have been trying," Paolo continued, "to think of another person in this house who would have done what you did, who would have given their coat, their warmth, their own body's heat, without any certainty that anyone was coming, without any guarantee that it would matter." He looked at her directly. "I cannot think of one." "They were babies," she said. Her voice was still thin from the night, but steadier than it had been. "Anyone would have—" "No," he said simply. "They would not." He set her hand down gently on the blanket, but he did not move the chair back. "You saved the Enrico bloodline," Paolo said, "in a blizzard, in a courtyard, alone, was without being asked, and without being seen." Something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, because Paolo Enrico's face was not built for softness, but opened in the way that certain closed things open when they have finally found the right conditions for it. "You will not be a servant in this house any longer, Julia. I will not allow it." She looked at him uncertainly. "You are the woman who kept my daughters alive when the person I trusted most in this world tried to take them from it." He held her gaze. "You are family. This is your home, and those children know your warmth, and that is not a thing I will permit you to walk away from." The storm outside had begun, somewhere in the depth of the night, to ease. The snow still moved against the glass, but without the driving urgency of earlier hours. Softer now, slower, was the blizzard exhausting itself the way all violent things eventually do. Julia looked at the window for a moment, then back at him. "I don't know how to be anything other than the help," she said quietly. It was the most honest thing she had said aloud in 4 years, perhaps longer. "I know," Paolo said. "We will figure out the rest." He did not leave. He settled back in the chair beside her bed, and outside, the storm continued to release its grip on the estate, and somewhere down the corridor, 2 small girls slept warm and unknowing in the arms of the nursemaid, and Julia Ferraro, invisible no longer the wallpaper, no longer the ghost, closed her eyes in a house that was, for the first time, actually hers.